Thus, the US President Donald Trump has given the lie to misleading stories about his health and indeed about his death by appearing live in Alabama in the last hour to confirm the relocation of US Space Command to a place called Huntsville. It was his choice in his first mandate. It was reversed by Joe Biden, he said, a political decision, but nonetheless, Trump has decided to take this big project back to what is very much a Trump supporting state. Here will be based something called the Golden Dome, which is set to be a space-inspired Star Wars-style defense mechanism across the United States. Ruling the skies is something that the people gathered around him said is extremely important in defense. And of course, the people in Ukraine know about that extremely well. Since 2022, when Vladimir Putin invaded, they've been asking for help to close the skies over their country. Trump, as always, when he speaks, segues into different party political issues in terms of his own campaigning agenda and, of course, trying to state that he's done things better than everybody else. So let's hear Trump now talking off the cuff there about Ukraine.
Have you spoken with President Putin?
Yeah, I don't want to. I have learned things that will be very interesting. I think in the next few days you'll find out.
Will there be any consequences if there isn't some type of announcement of a meeting with President Putin and President Zelensky?
Yeah,
and what could those consequences be?
We're going to see what happens. We're going to see what they do and what happens. I'm watching it very closely. Last week they lost 7,000 between the two countries. 7,313 soldiers, to be somewhat exact. For no reason whatsoever. And they're Russian and they're Ukrainian, but, you know, they're soldiers. I want to see it end. Yep.
His figures may or may not be correct, but it's worth pointing out that it's his friend Vladimir Putin who started this conflict in Ukraine. And it is obviously something that Putin could control if he decided to stop and go back. But he continues with his bombardment of Ukrainian territory, and it's his civilians that are very often the targets of what the Russians are doing there. Let's bring in Ian Reifowitz, the SUNY Distinguished Professor of Historical Studies at Empire State University, which is part of the State University of New York system. He's author of Riling Up the Base, examining Trump's use of stereotypes through an interdisciplinary lens. Ian, as always, thanks for joining us here in France 24. We appreciate your time. We've just heard Trump doing what he does, I think, best, freestyling, it seems, in many ways, basically bamboozling the press corps and most of the people listening by citing a number of different things, citing a number of numbers, impossible to fact-check in any way, shape or form. But in all of that, the overall thing is that he's the best at doing what he does. That's his agenda. Do you think people are starting to see through Trump in that way? What is your sense of the situation?
Well, first, it's great to see you again, Mark. And, you know, one wonders when people will know or recognize that, you know, the emperor is wearing no clothes. If you want to ask whether it's happening, we can look at polling data. Trump's polling data is not great, but it is steady. It's steady. Depending on which polling average you look at, generally speaking, the average of the polls has him roughly at about -10 in terms of disapproval versus approval, with an approval rating in the low 40s and a disapproval rating in the low 50s, about 10 points higher. That hasn't budged much in the last couple of months. It's not a great rating. It's in fact the worst rating at this point. 6-7 months into a presidency. It's worse than any president except Trump's first term. Biden, Obama, other recent presidents have all had a stronger rating. But I don't know that that there's been a significant shift recently. Maybe that's just because people know what they're getting with this president. They've been watching him certainly since he entered national politics in 2015, but they've arguably been watching him since he became a New York tabloid figure. And that's almost 40 years ago right now. And so to some degree, if he's going to continue to act the way he always has, I don't know that he can do much to change people's perception of him just based on his sort of performance. Now, if we see a real and new level of mental decline, then I think that could change things. But we haven't seen enough yet, I think, to shift opinion on that front significantly.
Indeed. Health rumours, fake news. That's what our caption is saying. That's what Trump said. And of course, he's appearing in public looking like he's across what he's talking about and looking relatively healthy. He's an old man, and that's something that comes to all of us in some way, shape or form. So, you know, we must accept that time moves on. However, the rumours surrounding Trump clearly might have had a malicious motivation. Let's set that to one side. In terms of what he's saying about the space project, now this is quite interesting, isn't it? Because this is creating something that I recall many, many years ago, the sort of Star Wars START treaty kind of, the project which was set up this idea of setting off rockets in space to stop nuclear weapons flying across the globe. This almost seems like it's going back to that kind of idea. It also echoes in some ways Israel's Iron Dome defense system too, the same kind of project. So this essentially is going to be based in Alabama, which is their great gain, but of course it's Colorado's great loss. And perhaps no coincidence that one that loses out is a Democratic state and the one that gains is a Republican state.
No coincidence. No, not at all. Look, there was a review done earlier this year, and it came back by the Trump administration, and it came back with an inconclusive finding as to whether the national security was enhanced by having this space command in one place or the other.
That's not what he said, is it? He said there were four different inquiries. That's what he said. He said four. He cited four.
Tomorrow he might say five. But I think the larger point is, even if you take his official report, his administration's official report at face value, if there's inconclusive benefits, why would you invest the, tens of millions or millions of dollars at least to move the location from one to another for an inconclusive benefit? So even if you take the Trump administration's report at face value, it still doesn't make a lot of sense. But it goes back to what you said. You have Colorado, which is a blue state, which voted against Trump in the presidential election in 2016, 2020, 2024, versus Alabama, which is almost as red a state as it gets, and which has been very solid behind Trump. Unlike Joe Biden, who made a specific point of putting projects from his infrastructure bill, from the CHIPS and Science Act, into red areas, red states, red counties, Trump does the opposite. Biden did that hoping that because these were good projects for America, that the Republican representatives in these areas would fight to keep them. Trump doesn't even look at it that way. He just says, well, I'm going to reward my friends and punish my enemies. And the interests of America, well, the interests of America are whatever is in my interest as Trump. And so therefore, that's why this makes sense from a national interest perspective, if you view national interests as being solely equal to the interests politically of Trump.
Ian, one of the journalists in Alabama put the question about the use of the National Guard. And clearly, we've seen the National Guard deployed in Los Angeles and New York, talk about it happening in Chicago, even talk about, from one of the journalists, the suggestion of why not put a guardsman in each school to prevent things like the recent Minneapolis shooting. Now, if you think about all the horrific things that have happened with guns in schools over the years in the US, perhaps there might be a point in that some way, shape or form. But it's the use of the National Guard, a kind of overruling of local authority, which has got many people worried about Trump's overall aim.
Right. Well, there's something called the Posse Comitatus Act, which was passed in the immediate post-Civil War years, which bans the use of federal troops for domestic law enforcement in the domestic law enforcement capacity. There was a ruling by a court today that said that the use of the National Guard in Los Angeles recently by this president was illegal, was unconstitutional. We'll see how that plays out as it goes to the upper court. So at the end of the day, what it comes down to is, will the Supreme Court act as a check on this president's incredibly expansive claims of his presidential authority? They haven't acted as much of a check as yet. We'll see how it goes on an issue-by-issue basis, whether it's on the National Guard in cities, whether it's on tariffs. This president wants to push the boundaries. He wants to claim, essentially, that if he thinks it's necessary to do something, it should be allowed for him to do it. We have a constitution that says otherwise, but only if the people in the Supreme Court are willing to make that statement and, like I say, check his authority.
Indeed, that opens a whole other chapter that sadly we don't have time for, Ian. But as always, pleasure speaking with you. Ian Reifowitz, SUNY Distinguished Professor of Historical Studies at Empire State University, which is part of the State University of New York system, and author of The riling up of the base, examining Trump's use of stereotypes through an interdisciplinary lens. Ian, as always, great to see you. Thank you very much indeed, Ian Reifowitz there with the analysis.